Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the dystopian novel They Said There Was. And we're on chapter 12 today. The mess had been sorted somewhat, except for the horrible smell of turpentine. But the next day was not enjoyable. The office was warm, and the mask and gloves felt sticky and wet on him. He could feel perspiration breaking out on his forehead and under his arms, and hoped he didn't look flushed to the other workers. Was it the lack of decent ventilation system in an office which saw a lot of traffic, or was he perhaps coming down with the illness? A temperature was one of the warning symptoms that you had it, with the cough as well as the sign you probably did. He looked towards the window facing into the car park and was horrified to see several of his co-workers standing together, smoking. They couldn't be unaware of the rules and were breaking them flagrantly. This was not acceptable. He knew none of them were in the age cohort that had yet received injections. He wondered what he could do. They should be reported, of course, to the management, but then again, if they heard it was him that reported them, they wouldn't be happy and might find ways to undermine his good standing at the office. Had he done anything they could report, though? He'd failed to tell at least 2 of them in the group to move back to the recommended distance from him several times already, when they'd approached him looking for forms and with borrowed files from the cabinets he oversaw, to return him directly, as he needed to see them before he went back to the filing cabinets to make sure they weren't out of sequence date-wise. They'd get him back with that, and there were cameras that could confirm it was true if they put in an official appeal on the sanction that they would get for this behaviour. They might even be suspended for the infringement. It might be worth pondering more and waiting. There were cameras pointed at the car park as well, but he had to work out the pros and cons before taking the plunge and reporting them. Sadly, the car park faced out the back, and the overmanager might miss some of these incidents, even if they were a regular occurrence, which they might be, and hadn't come to his attention before. He turned his attention to the door, which was always left open with its view of the front office, where he could see the backs of the workers staffing the window and vaguely make out the clients being dealt with on the opposite side through the plastic windows, which, since being swabbed down more often by staff who had little sanitizing spray bottles they sometimes brought to protect them from any germs that might make it through the slot at the bottom of each window, for the unwashed to push their forms through, were cloudier than before, giving the unwashed an even smokier appearance than they usually had, while puffing away on their fags in the morning queue outside. Sometimes staff needed to get up and down from their seats to go places with the paper files after also entering the information on their computer. And not only did they visit several desks on a regular basis during the day, they had also to navigate around each other to do so, not usually very successfully in terms of the rules. There was so little room in the space behind them, which essentially looked like a corridor, as thin as the supermarket aisles he'd visited. He realised with a sinking feeling that it might be only a question of time before he got sick. Indeed, he didn't feel well on heading out to the car park with his hot drink at his lunch break time, which started at 12:15 that day, and for the rest of the week, he noted from the roster in the break room, which was put up every Monday with that week's breaks on them at different times, to be fair to all. Sometimes his break was a little later, but he had the early one this week, perhaps a little unfortunately, since his morning break of 10 minutes was not until 11:45, rather close to the lunch break. But the roster was complex given the amount of staff and necessity to stagger breaks to leave the office open. It didn't open to clients all day, but of course paperwork had still to be done and records entered on the computers and so on. His cheese sandwiches with ham sharpened his appetite quickly, even if they were slightly tainted by the spray he'd used, and hadn't left time to adequately disperse as it evaporated into the confines of the car, and he could taste it lingering a bit on the bread. The chill that had come over him, worrying in its suddenness, as he crossed the car park, given that it was a warm day with no breeze to speak of, was soon forgotten as the news headlines came on. They were discussing the next cohort being done soon, with the injections of the first age group of 40 to 50s due to be completed within the next month, with more special flights arriving from all over the world to deliver supplies. Of course, the next one would probably include him as well as elderly types, as he was a frontline essential person who the smooth running of society in a crisis relied on. And he worked at a government office too. If he was extra cautious around everyone he ran into to make up for anyone else's hygiene lapses that he encountered during the workday, it might literally save his skin. After lunch, he folded up his lunch wrappers and shoved them in the paper teacup, then reached in the glove compartment under the dashboard to get another couple of masks and 2 pairs of gloves, then headed for the office bathrooms to gear up for the afternoon's work. He felt a lot cooler now. Not too hot, not too cold. Quite normal, in fact. Chapter 13. Deirdre's new painting obsession continued for weeks. He realised it might be, in fact, a blessing, because when she was at meals or in the living room, while he was seated and waiting for the news to come on, or perhaps one of the evening panel-style programmes discussing the developments and various economic implications of the new virus, she could be terribly talkative, and it was terrible rot when she was. She complained about anything she could think of, like not seeing her friends, and how Trina had rung her up crying about missing her birthday party, and how upset she was herself at that, just looking for things to be critical of, rather than seeing how well they were avoiding the death rate from spiralling out of control at the moment with all their special rules. Soon she'd be having her parties again out in pubs with Trina, whichever one that was, he reminded her, when the injections had been given out to everyone. He hoped she would not have her friends around as often when things returned to normal. But he kept this thought to himself. There wouldn't even be room in the living room, what with all the easels and jars with brushes in and canvases leaned against the remaining bookshelf that was still functioning somewhat in its original role. She'd shown him some of the things she'd painted, but they weren't very recognisable and not even finished. He could still see bits of white canvas not painted, and hadn't finished one before moving on to the next, so there were 4 unfinished things that he could see in 4 weeks. "That's nice," he said, pointing to one, so as not to offend, and fled the scene to take out the dustbins for collection day, which was the next morning. More tightening of the rules was bound to happen, since the injections would take a little while to be given to the whole population. And the biggest news was that the nation's leaders had decided it wouldn't be prudent to continue letting people travel too far from their homes, as some were taking advantage of the better weather to go to the beach or parks or other scenic areas in the countryside, which of course was a risk in the current circumstances that we shouldn't be taking, of spreading the illness further. We needed to remember that you might have it but not be getting sick immediately, as was often the case, but could still pass it along through transmitting, as they called the means by which it spread by air, and touching things with the virus on it. You just couldn't know if you were a spreader or not. The new rule stated that you could go more than 3 miles from your house, which still seemed a little extravagant to Robert under the dire circumstances, but it was an improvement that was bound to halt the spread a little, as they were saying it was still raging and had rampaged at a ferocious pace in foreign places, and would soon reach those levels here at home. A new international ministry called People in Managing Politics would be established that was to be composed of all sorts of top experts in all sorts of fields, from science to industry and politics, to coordinate the huge worldwide effort to beat the virus, along with the people themselves. It sounded like a wonderful idea and would ensure that ordinary people would have the best minds at their disposal to help them get through these difficult times and work with them. It was a team effort, and they were on the people's team, helping their leaders. He felt a surge of pride run through him to be part of such an important team. He understood how important it was for everyone to do their bit, even the lowliest people, as well as those with government connections in their line of work. They would beat this thing if they all stayed motivated and vigilant in sticking to the rules. It was such a small sacrifice to be making to stay close to home, and they did make it clear that this would only apply to those in non-essential roles, so it wouldn't affect his work, although it was more than 3 miles away, his house, from the office. More important information would be given on this in a speech by the national leader the next day. He would be at work at 3 p.m, but would be able to hear more details tomorrow when he got home, as he felt sure some of the highlights of the speech would be broadcast on the news then. He could always tune in the radio in the car at 3 in case it was live there, as his afternoon break was at exactly that hour for this week. He was looking forward to it. Deirdre didn't seem enthused about it when he turned from the screen, looking over the chair to see if she'd heard. She was still poking away in the corner at a canvas she'd returned to, straight after putting the dinner in the oven, and had been returning to at intervals between doing other things. She had a pile of her art books out on the floor beside her armchair, where the knitting bag had been, he saw. The mess elsewhere on the floor had been sorted out, put away somewhere, but she was creating more mess now to replace it. At least it kept her quiet. He stayed in his chair as the newsreader said there would be an extra show on afterwards to discuss the new restrictions. He folded his fingers together, elbows on chair edges, stretched out his legs and crossed his moccasined feet one over the other to settle in for another hour's viewing before the news again later. The news in the afternoon during his break in the car didn't feature the leader's speech to the nation, as it had been delayed for last-minute consultations and paper signing with the experts, possibly, from the pre-announcement meeting, which the news reporter said they were still in. He was excited about hearing it on the screen later, and when he arrived home, had just time to finish the slice of apple pie with custard that Deirdre had presented before the news started. I would have preferred the usual cream, Dee. You know how I like it the way it's supposed to be. His mother always put cream on theirs. They didn't have any round in the shop, Rob, she replied. The supplier didn't turn up today or something. Was she still going to the shop after all he'd said? I told you the knowledge that he had been right about the supply chain in anticipating menial workers might go out sick. Told you I was right to suggest we stock up. He chuckled as he thought of the extra food they'd bought to see them through. Why didn't you get extra cream? He added, thinking she always got cream, so why did she not get 2 weeks' worth when they had the opportunity? She looked at him a moment before replying. Cream goes off, Robert. Oh. He could hear the music for the news starting. I'll have my tea in the other room then, he said, making his way to the living room to take a seat. The big news of the sweeping new rules nationally, with the local travel precautions now in place, was first, naturally. The newsreader first summed up the rules. You were not to leave the house except for food or other essential shopping to be done, like getting your injection done. If you'd an appointment made for the first cohort, with the second cohort now being added to the appointments list at the various doctors' clinics, and you couldn't go further than 3 miles for anything other than those reasons, buying clothing, eating out, etc., were added to the ban on going to work. You could work from home now, unless you were one of the essential services dealing with the public in these areas, like a nurse or doctor delivering vital services in the crisis we were in, or delivering food to shops so the food supply chain didn't collapse completely. Bans that had already been implemented, like international travel, would stay in place, and local travel on public and private carriers would also have the ban imposed. There would be spot checks to enforce the ban and to inform anyone found travelling locally or out of their travel zone about the new rules. This seemed sensible, as there were bound to be people like Deirdre who didn't stay caught up on the news, who would be unaware of the new rules. He was gratified to see that they had promised to have extra police enforcers patrolling the streets. To do this, starting immediately. Next came the leader's speech, just snippets, but the full speech would be televised later, before the next evening news. But the highlights shown emphasised the need to all pull together in this big effort to save lives everywhere, as a team effort. The death rate was alarming and still climbing, as the big chart showed on the 4 screens set up behind his podium demonstrated. Robert knew that well, as he'd kept up with the charts, which wasn't easy considering they took all sorts of factors into account, so were presented with different types of stats on them so that they could be compared. You might be hearing the age range of worldwide deaths in the mornings, then the average death age later for a particular group by demographic or country, or a comparative statistic for something else later. He had tried to make adjustments in the notebook he kept for this, but it now had arrows going to different tables, and he'd started copying over some of the graphs as well, and bullet charts. Though not the pie charts, because he had to admit it was very specialised and technical, and he couldn't keep up with the figures. Frightening, though, how the figures were always higher for hospitalizations or deaths, or numbers of people that had now tested positive for the killer virus. Deirdre had joined him for this one, as she knew that it was to be on tonight. Maybe some of the news he shared with her was finally sinking in, and she'd made some effort to stay up to date, finally. They needed to all be on the same team, after all. He glanced sideways at her. Her brows were slightly furrowed. That was a good sign, then, that she might finally be taking the crisis seriously. Chapter 14. One of the desks in his office was empty the next morning. Someone had caught the illness. He'd noticed the John fella was one of the ones he'd seen taking breaks with others, standing far too close for compliance with the rules, and thought, it may be only a matter of days before more of his friends go. He smiled briefly before remembering where he was and controlled himself. With more absentees, or God forbid, deaths, he would be promoted to a private office, a new post soon, with a new underling replacing him. He thought back to when he'd last had a close encounter with John. He'd passed his desk a few times at least this week, and 2 of the others in the same office had gotten too close as well. He quickly made a mental check on his own body without moving to monitor for any temperature or anything out of the ordinary. His heart rate seemed a little too fast, a little louder too than normal, but that wasn't a listed symptom. His temperature was comfortable, except for his lower face, which fluctuated between hot and cold, depending on whether he breathed in or out in the wet mask he'd been wearing for half an hour since his arrival. And his hands, of course, which were always sweaty now. These were reassuring reminders, though, not concerning symptoms, of how well he was doing in staying safe from the virus. He just needed luck on his side for a week, perhaps, as his injection would sure to be ready then. Maybe that's where John went, he thought, feeling dejected. For an injection. But John did not appear the next day either, which made him happy. That was a good day at work, even with the huge queue of the unwashed and unemployed outside for the weekly signature day, which always was problematic with so many people to deal with. This problem, too, disappeared that week. A memo had been circulated that said that the clients will now be paid their allowances directly into their bank accounts, effective immediately, and are not required to appear for signature day until further notice. He didn't know whether he should be fuming or happy at the memo. Why should they not have to turn up to prove they were still unemployed and do spot interviews, which often put them off their game enough to claim they hadn't applied for jobs this week because there weren't any? This was one of the questions they could ask them at the front desk, and such a simple question could result in being handed another form they had to fill in within the week to prove they were looking or get terminated, as it was called. If they were not actively looking for work and able to demonstrate so by producing evidence, the flimsy lie that there was no work for them to bother applying for would result in their account closed indefinitely. There was an appeal form if they didn't like it, but often they were too lazy to fill that in. So clearly a lot of them had some kind of work already and hadn't admitted to it. He suspected many of them were criminals too. They had that look about them. This dropping of the signature requirement at the Human Welfare Office would embolden them and free them up for signing day. But at least he thought they would be prevented travelling around the country, finding places to rob things, as he'd heard other staff remark that this was what they probably got up to in all that free time, apart from drinking and smoking their handouts away. Now, if the forms were handed out to them, they wouldn't even be required to bring them in themselves and could post them in, meaning they would not have to face the usual interview which accompanied the receipt of them, which sometimes shook a few more low-hanging apples off the tree if it was conducted well. That was part of the reason it was necessary to have all the interview techniques in the manual for level 1. He might never have to interview anyone at the front desk, but a manager sometimes agreed to see the most difficult clients, to give them special attention, and had to be adept at interviewing very devious people skillfully, to extract a confession of not having sought any work within the demanded period so they could be terminated. This encouraged the laziest unemployed, who weren't bothered working, to get a job because they wouldn't have their assistance from the state anymore and would have to work. Another co-worker went sick by the end of that week, and everybody in the office was concerned that they would catch the virus too, he felt sure, as it must have crossed their minds that they could be next. He never overheard conversations about this, as communicating with other workers was frowned upon by management, unless it was a brief interaction about files. The only reason the phones on some of the desks rang was to connect those workers who coordinated most closely with the front desk staff members, technical staff, who were coming and going from the back offices to the front desks, collecting files from them or helping with technical hitches on their computers' input forms when their screens froze or misbehaved in some other way, asking them to help get the problem solved for them. Robert didn't have a phone on his desk, so had less going back and forth to do and less talking to other staff. With the break room rules that stipulated only one worker at a time to enter, and with his breaks spent outside in the car for news updates, he wasn't able to gauge how worried others were about catching the illness and dying. He was still thinking about the implications of this new development when he heard shouting coming from the direction of the front desk. An unemployed was standing in a very threatening manner, leaning into the cloudy screen, with his nose clearly on it, screaming, "How am I supposed to go to a job interview when everything's fucking closed?" The woman at the counter, Mary something, was frozen in place. He could tell from her back that it was under control as usual, because this kind of disgraceful outburst did happen from time to time. The unemployed were a very jealous bunch of anyone more respectable than them, as well as unreasonable at the best of times. The man was probably drunk, and the security guard was quick to arrive on the scene and tell him to leave. Someone had broken a screen once, he'd been told, when he'd first started work, and the overmanager was showing him around and explaining about how the layout was designed with humans in mind. He told him then that the glass was reinforced after several incidents where clients had become aggressive. He'd also been told that several years back, when the immigrants all flooded the office, the manager whispered confidentially to him that during the night someone had managed to disable the camera positioned above the main entrance of the building and covered the sign which said Human Welfare Office with a sticky backed one that had some German words on, which, when the manager had looked them up on the internet translator, said, "Work makes one free." He had to ask what that meant, as the manager was looking at him rather meaningfully, as though he expected some type of response other than a nod. But he was given none, so he had to nod and pretend he knew. The man might not be arrested because, although his manner was very threatening, he hadn't had time to break anything, and his voice could be heard complaining more distantly as he was ushered out of the building before he could. They were so bloody hostile, the unemployed. The man's files would be terminated now, naturally, but these would be filed away for reference, and in case he tried to return and claim he was still eligible to get his handouts, as some of them tried to do. Some even filled in appeal forms, though they usually didn't get very far with them, only to one of the manager's offices, and then straight out the door again. Those files, of course, were returned with extra J101 forms, completed by the manager to go into the filing cabinets with the rest of the files in their folder. Records always had to be kept, and that's where Robert's efficiency really made him an indispensable asset to the office and to the nation, since he was a representative of the state in his work role. He checked his phone at lunch break after turning on the radio, as he always did, out of habit, like checking his watch, and was surprised to see a missed call displayed. He didn't usually get calls, but this was from his wife. He rang back to see what she wanted. "Oh, hi, Robert. I rang you a few minutes ago. I thought you might be on lunch break." "What's happened?" he asked, thinking it must be important, since she didn't usually ring when he was at work. "The clinic rang me this morning. They say we can have an appointment next week, but I wasn't sure when would suit you, so I said I'd ring them back. They have 2 slots we can choose from, Monday at 10:15 or Thursday at 2:45. Which one do you want? Because I don't mind which. Monday, of course. We want the earliest slot because we could be infected or dead by Thursday. Stupid woman. Okay, Robert, I'll ring them back. They're closed for now for lunch until 2 p.m., but I'll ring them then. Are you having a nice day? Jesus. Yeah, I have to go. Make sure you ring them at 2 so the slot isn't gone. Talk to you later. Bye. He pressed the hang up button and proceeded to think while munching his sandwich, washing it down with tea from the paper cup in the dashboard cup holder, taking care not to spill anything or get crumbs on the carpet or seat. Finally, they were at the finish line where worrying about getting infected was concerned. Relief washed over him, and with it, exhaustion. He must still be vigilant, though, as Monday hadn't yet arrived. There were days to go and the weekend to get through still. From Monday, though, he could relax, safe in the knowledge that he wouldn't get infected. The protection gear would still be required, but it wouldn't be long before everyone had been done and life could get back to normal. He shoved his paper cup with its sandwich wrapper inside the small plastic dustbin bag he kept on the passenger seat floor, closed with a snap-style clip, into the pile of used masks and gloves from the week, and snapped it shut again. Before checking his watch, turning off the radio, and sterilizing his hands once again. Before opening a new packet of gloves and one containing a mask in preparation for returning to his desk. He put extras in his pocket as he would need to visit the toilet facilities first. Chapter 15. He had his form filled in and permission granted to get Monday off, and he had filed away the permission slip himself after the manager had sent someone to his desk to return it, signed off by the older manager. He spent the weekend looking forward to his appointment, and even the fact that all the back-facing windows in the house were due for a cleaning, a job he wasn't fond of, as it meant the insides needed to be done too, as well as his wife's car needing a wash, didn't spoil his buoyant mood. He already had the sense that he was approaching the finish line to claim his prize, life. He couldn't get sick now or die once injected. The new vaccine had been thoroughly tested out on various animals, and the results of the tests that experts had carried out were that it worked to protect you from the virus. They knew how the virus was made now, and that was all they needed to get something to kill it off. Science was amazing, and the news reports often showed shots of scientists doing things in their labs during the informative segments, where they told you what the virus looked like and how dangerous it was, requiring special ways of handling it to study it under microscopes and test things out on it. He'd never taken science in school, his father insisting that accounting was a more useful skill and might get you a job for life if you took a few clerical courses later on. That was solid advice, as he was making his way up to management level, at not even middle age yet, really. There was no stopping his progress once he was safe from the risk of death from the virus. They pulled up to the car park outside the supermarket, across from the new health clinic. The car park was very full, and he had to circle around the lane slowly, looking for a space. Some stupid person had a trolley of groceries out too far in the narrow lane between the parking spots, and had to be beeped at twice before she finally reacted and moved herself out of the way. As they approached the doors to the clinic, he could see a lot of people lined up. Not a queue for this as well, surely. They must all have appointments, so why were they queuing? Well, go up and see what's happening, Deirdre. He had to call her back because she seemed to be approaching the queue rather than the door, a few feet to the side of which was a movable bollard with a tape to keep the queue from obstructing the traffic flow of the car park. Go to the door and ask, he hissed. She approached the door while he stood waiting at a reasonable distance from any contagion that might be lurking in the queue, and watched her press the buzzer, then lean in. She stayed in this position, and he wondered why she was still talking into it, instead of getting them to buzz her in so he could follow. He looked at his wristwatch. They were exactly 5 minutes early, which was good timing on his behalf, but he'd been watching the time over breakfast and set off early to make sure of being on time, since it was possible their slot would be skipped if they weren't in the waiting area inside ready to see the doctor. She didn't open the door, but turned and walked back to him. "We have to join the queue. They want everyone to wait outside." "But we'll be late. Can you not see the length of this queue?" It was unbelievable that they would be expected to wait around for God knows how long, when they had already been given an appointment time. "Maybe they're running late or something," she said, making excuses that were no excuse. Appointments were made for a specific time, and this was just very poor organization. He realized they could be standing for hours if all these people were also supposed to be seen. Some of them might even be there for less important things than getting their injections, if the hunched over elderlies with their frail frames were anything to go by. They were in the same cohort as his wife and himself, but he hoped they wouldn't take up too much of the clinic's time when they reached their doctor's office, with complaining about other ailments instead of keeping the traffic outside moving smoothly by keeping their visit brief. It would take at least 10 minutes between getting up the stairs, being checked in at reception, and then getting seated, files checked, and finally sleeves rolled up for the job to be done, even if there were a lot of doctors in the clinic. No, this just wasn't on. He walked in what he hoped was a confident manner, up to the glass doors and the buzzer, and pressed it. "Yes," said a voice. "Myself and my wife have an appointment for our injections, which is already running late." The voice interrupted him before he had even finished the sentence. "Join the end of the queue. Thank you for your patience." Then there was another click, which he knew was not the door being buzzed open, but a finger coming off the intercom connection. He could feel his blood rising at the indignity, but clearly he could not do anything about it. He would have to wait for however long they chose to leave himself and his wife hanging about at their pleasure. How dare they? It was a moment before he could collect himself to turn towards his wife and away from the faces that were watching him in the top of the queue. His wife followed him as he began the long journey to the end. He counted people as he went. It was outrageous. The elderlies would take forever to get themselves organised, to even start moving in the queue when it was their turn, let alone position themselves correctly before limping into the elevator, since some of them looked too feeble to make it up the stairs under their own power as they stood hunched and wrinkled, waiting blankly to be called. His wife and himself stood, no doubt, he thought, both feeling angry at the humiliation of being told to arrive at a particular time only to be fobbed off, and being told to wait with the others. They were at risk, even with the distance between people, which at least was being observed, although some elderlies had helpers keeping them up by holding their elbows or putting an arm around their backs to take the weight off their bird-like legs. He hoped these were family members, as they were standing much too close for safety, and some of the elderly's masks were ill-fitting on the withered faces, sagging and letting air in, or just as bad, filthy, clearly having been reused several times. The queue inched forward, only one or at most two being admitted by the receptionist, who was stationed inside somewhere, only appearing at the door after the buzzer sounded and the door opened and her hand appeared, waving the next one in after checking their name on a list. Sometimes there was a further delay as she shouted the name several times down the queue before someone stepped out and made their way through the door, which the receptionist held open. When they had gone through, it closed again with an echoing boom, and the rest in the queue settled down again, shuffling forward a couple of paces and rearranging their positions, looking back and forward to make sure the space stayed open between themselves and the person in front and behind. There were several awkward moments where voices could be heard raised as someone had to be reminded to keep their distance. There were yellow lines painted on the ground, specifically to sort out these arguments, which you could point at to make it clear to the person infringing the rules. He checked himself and his wife's position in relation to the lines each time they moved forward a bit. Although he couldn't check his watch to get some indication of when they would reach the inner sanctum of the clinic and the doctor's office, because the queue was not in the order the names were being called out, and they might be called at any moment. They hadn't long to wait. Their names were called after 22 minutes waiting. 22 minutes after the official appointment time, and they stepped forward under the jealous eye of others still waiting to climb the sets of concrete stairs to the doors of the clinic. The receptionist moved rapidly, and they arrived outside the clinic doors at the same moment an elderly was getting extracted from the elevator by her husband, who seemed to be in charge of the battered cargo, though rather bad on the old legs himself. The receptionist had a card that she swiped through the intercom to unlock the doors, and he and his wife were waved through, with the elderlies told to wait a moment outside until the other patients he and his wife had cleared the area. Their doctor was there in reception, fully kitted out, head to toe, in an impressive set of protective gear, comprising the surgical masks and gloves everyone wore, but also a plastic apron and some kind of elastic paper hat and paper shoes as well. Deirdre seemed to recognise him immediately somehow, although little of him was showing, and greeted him before they were asked to follow him down the corridor with doctors' offices lining it. He noticed these were all open, and he could see various people with sleeves rolled up and doctors giving them their injection. One old woman was in a vest, and he turned away from the sight in disgust. The process itself was very efficient. He let his wife go first with her injection, as they were asked in a jolly way to decide who wanted to be first. He remembered to look away before the needle pierced skin, and looked out of the car park when that was happening. Less than 5 minutes later, they were being escorted back to the reception desk for the next patient meet and greet the doctor had to perform. So it was very satisfactory as far as speed was concerned. It felt wonderful outside when he saw the queue again, and it hit him like a breath of fresh air that he didn't have to be afraid of people infecting him anymore. The injection had liberated him from all that. When his wife pointed out to him that she wanted to pick up something in the supermarket, a rhubarb crumble for their dessert with some ice cream to go with it, he didn't mind at all. He waited in the car, since he'd had quite enough queuing for the day, but checked his watch again to make sure he wasn't eating into his lunch break and in danger of not getting into work on time for the afternoon's work, since he only had the morning off for the injection. It still read the same time. How could this be? He put it to his ear to listen for ticking, then tapped it a few times. Battery run out, probably. He liked old-style watches, as his father always wore, but it made sense to have a battery type, because you couldn't overwind them and break them. He'd asked Deirdre to get a new battery when she had time to shop again. He checked his phone for the time display. Of course, she was in the shop, so he could tell her now. She was bound to have her phone with her and on, since she was always talking to her friends on it. He rang. She picked up after 3 rings. Yes, Robert. My watch battery has died. Can you get a new one in there? I think I noticed some at the checkout when we were there last. They're only for bigger things like radios and flashlights, Robert. Yours are the special ones we get in the jeweller's shop, remember? He didn't, since she usually left his watch in if the battery needed doing, but he hadn't considered this. Well, we don't have time to hang around today, so I'll give you the watch later to get done. Hurry up, I've got to get to work. He hung up and slipped his watch into his pocket so he would notice it gone later from his wrist and remember to give it to her to get fixed. He made it back to work in time, but Deirdre had nattered away about the ice cream because she forgot she'd to get the bus home after he left her before turning into the car park for his afternoon work, and she'd run on about how the ice cream would have melted in the heat of the bus before she got it home. She also said she couldn't get the watch fixed. He'd forgotten everything was closed, including the jeweller's shop, since jewellery was hardly an essential item in such times. He'd have to get used to making do with the phone for a few weeks. And there was a wall clock in the office, as well as a time display on each computer, so it was only at home that the new routine would be harder to get used to. Small sacrifice for the greater good. He was doing his part, and proud to be. Chapter 16. Deirdre continued complaining over dinner. The bus had been delayed in its journey at 2 different points with police stops. They boarded the bus and asked several passengers where they were going to check if they were out of their essential travel zone, as they called it now. Deirdre had been questioned on one of these stops, and on the other, a passenger rearrangement had to be organised to move some people who had ignored the signs on some seats saying this seat is out of use, resulting in them sitting dangerously close to other potentially not yet vaccinated people on the bus. 2 people who admitted to being last to board the bus when the police asked the whole bus about it had to get off to catch another bus. Deirdre hadn't been last on, so she was let stay. Well, there's talk of bringing in vaccination status papers you can show soon. Remember, the doctor told us about it. We'll be getting ours soon after we get onto the government website he told us about. That'll speed all that up. Why the doctor couldn't organise these papers himself, he wasn't sure, but he supposed it took a bit of the workload off if he got patients to do some of the work by signing into the website he'd handed out the cards with the address on. Robert, it was humiliating. And they looked in my shopping bag and said the rhubarb pie didn't look like an essential item. I had to tell them about the doctor's appointment then, and of course they wanted to see the doctor's address then, and I didn't have his card to hand, and I wasn't sure of the street address and had to give him the phone number. They were taking down names and addresses of people who were sitting on the wrong seats and giving them lectures about the virus being airborne and telling them not to do it again. Everyone was humiliated. It didn't seem right. It's a pandemic, Deirdre. We're all expected to do our part, and they're only doing their job. A very good one, it seems. She was whining about sensible precautions, it seemed to him. The pie without ice cream wasn't very nice. She hadn't gone to the bother of cream either. He checked his watch out of habit before realising it wasn't there, then took out his phone to see if the news was going to start soon. Later, he would have to register them both on the online database where you applied for your vaccine cards to show you were injected and no risk to others. That would cover them in the coming weeks for police spot checks and so on the roads if they had to get essentials or go to work. He had all their household files in the spare room with their citizen numbers in them and anything else he might need to input. The doctor's office must be coordinating their files with the government's ones. He hadn't had time to ask the doctor about this since they'd been ushered out so quickly to keep infection from spreading around. The amount of time you spent talking to someone mattered as well, according to all the news updates and guidelines reminders featured on them. Had Deirdre not been injected, the long bus journey home would have been very risky, with the virus no doubt circulating in the closed space, looking for more people to infect. Deirdre was spending more time in the garden again, he noticed, as he settled down after the news to go into the government site and help them with their coordination of the plan to defeat the virus. He watched her bend and pull weeds out from around what looked like other weeds to him, but which he knew were pea plants because she was enthusing regularly about how they were in flower and about to produce fruit. Not that peas were a fruit. They were a vegetable. Her painting hadn't lasted long. The easel disappeared after she'd failed to produce anything that looked like the photos of the ducks and whatever from the park. She'd hauled it out in the garden after that to try to paint things on front of her, but every time it rained she had to run in and out with canvases and turpentine, and she probably realised it was a stupid hobby to start with at that point. She'd continued to pester him about going for walks, but he stayed firm and reminded her that he was too busy for pointless things. That week he was stopped himself on the way to work, but by then he had signed up with his details on the special Vaccine Pass website and had a number for his account to ID him as someone to send out a vaccine pass to, along with his wife, who would get a unique identifier vaccine pass with the government official stamp on it as well. Luckily, he'd written this ID number on the back of the clinic business card he'd made sure to pick up at the doctor's reception desk in case he wanted to check that his details had gone through correctly. One had to dot every I and cross every T in case others' files weren't up to scratch. The police officer holding up the line of traffic with a colleague was satisfied he was fully compliant with the rules on being shown the card and taking down the details. It was nice to see the rules being stringently enforced, but not as nice to find on checking his phone just before the traffic took off that he would probably be late for work. He liked watching other motorists in the stopped line of traffic going the opposite direction too, and noticed the ones wearing masks in their cars. They must be the ones that had not received their injections yet, still worried about germs getting into their car. This made him feel more relaxed, and he shifted his weight a little in the seat and rolled down the window to accommodate the police officer approaching him with a big smile before he bridged the official space between them, with an arm held out to point at him and a hand held something or other to enter data on while he asked pertinent questions about who he was and where he was going. He arrived half an hour late. He would have to set out earlier in future to ensure this didn't happen again. He would have a half an hour in the car park to listen to news shows on the car radio if he arrived on time, as well as being able to keep up if he got stuck in traffic stops again. He was well abreast of all the news as things stood and could react accordingly to help the government in the race to stop all the deaths. He didn't know anyone personally who had died yet. All Deirdre's friends seemed to be still alive, since she would be sure to inform him if they were sick or died. She was still on the phone to them daily, and sometimes talking on the phone even while doing other things like dinner. He'd asked her not to put it on speaker, propped up, when in the middle of dinner preparations, as he couldn't stand to listen to such inane conversations, but he'd couched it in terms she could understand better, pointing out that it would make her more likely to forget about the dinner and burn it when it went untended. She still often left it on the kitchen countertop during dinner time, but after a few meaningful looks when it interrupted their meal, she knew to turn it to silent mode so that its ringing would not upset their meal. He was shocked to hear that Deirdre's friend, Trina, had organised a secret meet-up at her house to make up for the missed birthday party. This was not allowed. What if the neighbours saw hippies arriving to her home? He asked, astonished. Did they not know that there was a new phone line, especially to report breaches of rules like this one? There had indeed been a new service just established to allow citizens to report anyone behaving dangerously by flouting the rules and having people around to their houses or not wearing masks or anything related to clamping down on breaking the rules. She should be reporting them, not telling him about the cheese and wine you missed out on. He was shocked at her selfishness in being weak about telling Trina to stop trying to break rules instead of keeping on trying to have her parties without a care in the world for anyone else. You are an utter bastard sometimes, Robert, she announced, after his short explanation of how they were breaking sensible rules selfishly when others were working hard to help everyone, which was intended purely as an educational remark. Then she walked out of the house. He could see her in the back garden, through the kitchen window, practically slamming a large watering can into the tap on the water barrel attached to the roof gutter by a wide pipe she'd run up to it. Cranky bitch, to talk to him that way. She had some cheek when she was trying to keep everyone safe and healthy. He cared more about her hippie friends than she did, and there were likely to be some of them that still didn't have their injections. She didn't care if they died, yet she was calling him a bastard. He slammed the kitchen door on the way to his seat in front of the screen. She hadn't even made the tea for them, and clearly wasn't on the same team he was on. As he waited, after clicking the remote control to get the screen to spring to life, he wondered if there were many more like Deirdre and her friends breaking the rules. He hadn't noticed anyone sticking out from the crowd as he passed the shops and crowded streets on his way home in the car. There wasn't the crowd there used to be, in town, mind you, which was a good sign, because with almost everything shut, they couldn't congregate easily. But who knows what they were up to in their own homes? Not everyone had a husband in control of the situation, or had a husband who even was as fully informed and conscientious as himself, he felt sure. While he hadn't witnessed any breaches himself, he had to admit he hadn't been watching for them closely enough, and had only noticed his co-workers taking breaks together in the car park because he was in a state of high alert at the time, not having had his injection then and being frantic about getting sick or dropping where he stood without even a manager's badge to show for all his work. He was glad to hear the newsreader announce the new measures that were to come into force starting immediately. The very old and the infirm would be asked to stay off the streets in a new policy called safe nesting. They were to stay in their houses or care homes and not go out at all. If they had family, the family could deliver food to them, but they were the most fragile in society, so they needed to be protected most from the virus. When all the injections had been given out all over the nation, they could leave their houses, but must stay in until then. Good. If they were so weak in their old age that they were perfect carriers for transmission, then this was a very sensible move. Old people didn't do very much at the best of times, he presumed, and the ones in the queue at the doctor's office could hardly walk, so they wouldn't miss going anywhere or be discommoded, as a person with an important role to carry out in a vital job like his might be. Deirdre hadn't returned from the garden, but clearly wasn't interested in keeping up with the rules, as she'd buried her head in one of her books. She seemed to have taken up some sort of course that you could do online, as books were arriving to the house. The postman hadn't died anyway. Must have had his shot. The news didn't give death figure updates, but the phone and computer were more useful for that, since there were new websites the government had put up, where you could see how the curves on the graphs were still rising. He hoped the death rate would start turning around soon, and the death curves they showed on graphs on the news nightly start moving down now that the vaccines were being given out. The younger people would be next, after they'd finished getting through the vital workers in their prime age, and the old feeble people first. He knew about half the nation were protected from death or passing on their infections now. You had to keep checking the figures because you didn't see people who were sick. They were whisked away into hospitals quickly before they could infect anyone else, and they might have spread their germs even before then. If they were lucky enough to survive, they would be injected, so they couldn't do it again. There was a handy phone app that the government had issued to everyone that showed not just your injection status when your application for a proof of vaccination had been processed, but also showed the changing daily figures for how many nationally were vaccinated. It was reassuring to see that the figures rose quickly on the screen showing an injection needle and a government logo, because it represented the return of the routine of old life as he was starting to think of it. The new life took a lot of effort, what with all the taking on and off of masks at work. He wasn't concerned about getting infected himself anymore, of course, but one still had to do all the rules or it would be frowned on, and he might be called into the manager's office to explain himself.